Imagine booking a round trip flight from Vancouver to Toronto for $99 or Montreal to Calgary for $150. Sounds impossible, right? Yeah, it does because it's impossible. That kind of thing would only happen in my dreams. In my last video, I did a deep dive into why Canadian domestic flights are so expensive. We talked about geography, lack of competition, and those massive, really massive fees and taxes that make up nearly a third of your ticket price. So the question is cheap domestic travel in Canada actually achievable? Or are we stuck with high prices forever? Today we'll explore what it would actually take to make Canadian domestic travel affordable and whether or not it's realistic. Before we talk about what Canada could do, let's look at what other countries have done. Because believe it or not, some places with similar challenges to Canada have actually managed to make domestic travel way more affordable. Let's start with Europe. You can fly from London to Barcelona for 35 euros. That's about 55 Canadian dollars. London to Rome, maybe 50 euros, sometimes even cheaper. How exactly were they able to achieve this? Three main factors come to mind. First is the Open Skies Agreement. After the EU deregulated air travel in the 1990s, airlines could operate routes across borders without restrictions. So Ryanair in Ireland could compete with Lufthansa in Germany. Competition exploded. Next is the secondary airports. See, companies like Ryanair are not fighting for slots at Heathrow or Charles de Gaulle. They went to smaller, cheaper airports outside major cities. So they have lower landing fees, faster turnarounds, cheaper operations. Then you have the bare-bones service. No free checked bags, no free meals, no assigned seats unless you pay. Ryanair, I'm looking at you. They stripped out every cost they could and passed the savings to passengers. Now, I know this is an apple to orange comparison. Europe has advantages that Canada doesn't. You can cross multiple countries in Europe in the same distance as Vancouver to Toronto. But still, Europe proves that policy choices matter. Deregulation and competition work. Now, let's go to the end of the world and take a look at Australia. Australia has a lot in common with Canada. That's our spirit animal right there. It's massive, 7.7 million square kilometers with a low population density, only about 27 million people. So ordinarily, it's long distances between cities. And yet, domestic flights in Australia are consistently cheaper than in Canada. Sydney to Melbourne, about 700 kilometers. You can find round-trip flights from 150 to 200 Australian dollars. That's roughly 140 to 190 Canadian dollars. Sydney to Melbourne, by the way, is roughly the same distance as Toronto to Quebec City. And they have this advantage because 4 major carriers compete: Qantas, Virgin Australia, Jetstar, and Rex Airlines. But here's the key difference. The Australian government treats aviation as critical national infrastructure. They invest in airports, they support competition, they don't charge airlines the kind of rent and fees we do in Canada. So geography matters, sure, but policy matters even more. And Australia proves that a large country with low population density can still have affordable domestic travel if the government prioritizes it. And then there's our best friend, the United States. Now, the US isn't perfect. It really isn't. But their domestic flights are still cheaper than Canada on average. Also boils down to competition. You've got 4 major legacy carriers: American, Delta, United, and Southwest. Plus, there are also low-cost carriers like Spirit, Frontier, Allegiant, and JetBlue. Compare that to Canada, where Air Canada and WestJet control 74% of the market. That's not competition. But the biggest difference is in how airports are funded. In the US, the airports receive federal funding and municipal support. They are treated like roads and bridges, the kind of public infrastructure that benefits everyone. In Canada, airports are on their own. So they charge passengers directly to fund infrastructure. And oh yeah, they also pay rent to the federal government. The US model is not perfect, but it's a reminder that how you fund airports directly affects what passengers pay. So what would Canada need to change to make cheap domestic travel a reality? Let's break it down. If Canada wanted to seriously reduce domestic flight costs, it would require coordinated policy changes across multiple levels of government. Real fundamental shifts in how we think about air travel. Let's go through them one by one. The first key change would be to eliminate or drastically reduce airport fees and rent. Let's go back to the ticket I priced the other day, Vancouver to Toronto round trip. Base fare $325, not terrible, right? But then comes the add-ons. NAV Canada surcharge $70, Air Traveler Security Charge $18.92, GST $20.70, Airport Improvement Fees $71.45, total fees and taxes $181. That's nearly 36% of the ticket price. Final ticket price $506 for a domestic flight. So in terms of policy change, the federal government could actually eliminate or cap airport rent, reduce airport improvement fees to US comparable levels, maybe even provide some federal funding like the US does. And then we're looking at estimated savings for passengers at about $50 to $100 per round trip ticket. That's significant. Next would be to open up the market to real competition. Right now, Canada has something called cabotage laws. These laws prohibit foreign airlines from operating domestic routes within Canada. So Southwest or Spirit can't fly you from Vancouver to Toronto. That route is protected. On top of that, foreign investors can own more than 49% of the Canadian airline, significantly limiting international investment and making it hard for new competitors to enter the market. I will try to create our own budget airlines, but they just keep failing. So we need to relax cabotage law. Maybe allow foreign carriers to operate some domestic routes, especially where there's limited service. Revisit the foreign ownership cap. Create real competition. When airlines compete, passengers win. Then the government needs to reduce the taxes and regulatory burden on airlines and passengers. The security charges, improvement fees, and taxes that passengers pay. Then there's fuel taxes that airlines have to pay. Oh, and there's federal carbon tax on fuel, which has even more costs. So the government can roll back or freeze the Air Traveler Security Charge, review the NAV Canada's fee structure, harmonize fuel taxes with US rates, maybe provide carbon tax rebates for domestic flights to encourage Canadians to actually explore their own country instead of flying abroad. This might sound like small changes, but they add up very fast. Another policy change would be to invest in airport infrastructure and capacity. Limited capacity means fewer flights. Fewer flights equals less supply. Less supply equals higher prices. So federal funding to expand capacity at major airports will go a long way. Build or expand secondary airports. Invest in high-speed rail between major corridors like Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa. More capacity would mean more competition. More competition would mean lower prices. So those are the 4 major policy changes that could bring down prices. Sounds great, right? Well, here's the problem. There are some serious barriers standing in the way. So let's be realistic. Even if these policy changes could work in theory, actually implementing them, that's a whole different story. Because first we have political challenges. The $495 million in airport rent, that's revenue the federal government collects every year. Giving the hub means the federal government has to find that money somewhere else, or maybe they have to cut spending. And politicians, they don't like giving up revenue, especially when airports are technically profitable under the current model. Then there's the regional politics. What works for Toronto and Vancouver won't necessarily work for remote communities in Nunavut or Northern Ontario. If you open up competition and allow foreign carriers to fly domestic routes, they'll focus on the profitable routes, Toronto to Vancouver, Montreal to Calgary. They're not going to fly so equally to Yellowknife. And then there's the national sovereignty argument. Some politicians worry that if we allow too much foreign competition, this could actually weaken Canadian carriers, costing us jobs and reducing our control over a critical industry. These are not unreasonable concerns, I understand that, but they make change very slow and complicated. And then there's the economic realities. Even if we create a perfect policy environment, will budget airlines actually survive in Canada? Because we've already tried multiple times and they keep failing. Canada is expensive to operate in. High fuel costs, harsh weather requiring specialized equipment, long distances with relatively few passengers. And here's the chicken and egg problem. Budget airlines need high passenger volumes to be able to offer low prices. But passengers won't book in high volume unless prices are already low. Someone has to take the financial risks first. Also, geography still matters. So even with perfect policies, a Vancouver to Toronto flight, 3,400 kilometers over mostly empty land, that would never be as cheap as London to Barcelona. Then there's trade-offs. Every policy choice has consequences. Consequences. If we cut airport fees and eliminate rent, who pays for airport infrastructure? Airports still need to maintain runways, terminals, security system. That money has to come from somewhere. Do we shift the cost to taxpayers? That means people who don't fly are subsidizing those who do. Is that fair? If we allow foreign airlines to operate domestic routes, what happens to Air Canada and WestJet? Do they cut jobs? Do they reduce service to smaller communities? There's a reason Air Canada flies to places like Yellowknife and Prince Rupert, even though those routes are unprofitable. The cross-subsidize them with profits from Toronto to Vancouver. So if you introduce ultra-low-cost foreign competition on the profitable routes, does Air Canada pull out of the unprofitable ones? These are real questions, and they don't have easy answers. So given all these challenges, what's actually realistic? What could actually happen? Let's talk about the most likely scenarios. In the short term, the next 2 to 5 years, here's what's realistic. Modest fee reductions. Maybe the government caps or slightly reduce airport rents. Maybe they roll back part of the security charge increase. Baby steps. Maybe 1 or 2 additional budget carriers manage to survive and compete on major routes. That way, we can see 15 to 25% price decreases on high demand routes like Toronto to Vancouver or Toronto to Calgary. But flights to smaller cities, regional routes, those will probably stay expensive. It's not dramatic, but it's something. In the medium term, like 5 to 10 years, if public pressure builds and if politicians prioritize this issue, we could see more significant reform. Maybe the federal government eliminates airports rent entirely. Maybe they start providing direct funding to airports like the US does. Maybe they relax cabotage laws and allow limited foreign competition on select routes. Then we would actually see true competition on major routes with probably a 30 to 40% price decrease. That would be a game changer, but it requires political will. Now, let's talk about what's unlikely, at least in the foreseeable future. Don't expect European-style ultra-cheap fares. You're not going to see $50 flights from Toronto to Vancouver, except an aerofare maybe. The geography simply doesn't allow for it. Canada is just too big, too empty, and too expensive to operate in. So even with the perfect policies, our domestic flights will never be as cheap as Europe's. And don't expect flights to remote northern communities to suddenly become affordable. Those routes will always require government subsidy. Don't expect the complete elimination of Air Canada and WestJet duopoly. They're too entrenched, too big. They'll remain dominant even if new competitors enter. So adjust your expectations. Cheaper? Yes, possibly. Cheap? Probably not. So, could Canada ever have cheap domestic travel? The answer is yes, but only with significant policy changes. Canada could have cheaper domestic travel, but not without deciding that mobility is a public good, not just a private purchase. Until then, Canadians will keep doing what the system rewards, leaving the country for vacation instead of exploring their own backyard. If you found this breakdown valuable, hit the like button and consider subscribing to the channel. I post Canada-related travel content, travel guides, hotel reviews, and cost breakdowns. And now I'm also looking at the economics behind travel and tourism in Canada. Thanks for watching, and See you soon.